I work part-time at a diner, but my tuition is pretty expensive, so I've had to take on a couple side gigs to stay afloat. About a year ago, I started babysitting for some of my family friends. It's an easy job, and I usually have time to catch up on my homework. Last month, I started having car problems, so I needed some extra money fast. My aunt told me that her coworker was in need of a babysitter, but the house was in Golden Valley, which is a pretty sketchy area outside the city. I normally wouldn't go to a place like Golden Valley, but I really needed the money, so I said yes. The house was on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, and it wasn't even a house. It was a double-wide trailer behind a bunch of broken-down cars. I felt very unsafe. It was already nighttime when I arrived. I knocked on the door, and a young couple answered. They both smiled at me, but I could tell by their expressions that they weren't expecting me to be black. There aren't a lot of people of color in our city, and I doubt that there are any in Golden Valley. Besides, my aunt is white, and I guess they assumed I would be too. They nervously invited me inside and gave me a quick tour. Their baby, Benji, was already asleep in his room. All I had to do was check on him every 20 minutes. It seemed like an easy gig. Then, the wife stopped at the door to one of the other bedrooms. My heart sank. There was a large Confederate flag on the door. She looked at me sheepishly and told me to stay out of that room. Why? I asked, assuming that they had some racist crap inside. The husband explained, My dad's in there. He's old and feeble, so we don't trust him with Benji. Just don't disturb him, okay? I definitely won't, I told them. I just hoped he stayed in there and didn't bother me. The couple looked at each other nervously, then wished me luck and left. I sat on their dusty sofa and studied for my next econ test. Every 20 minutes, I popped my head into Benji's room. He slept peacefully. Everything was going well, until I heard a loud noise outside the trailer, as if someone had dropped something big and heavy. There were voices, too. I know I should have ignored it, but the voices got louder, and I could hear one guy shout, Hurry up! They'll be home soon! Whatever was happening outside, it wasn't good. These people were paying me to protect their child, and I couldn't just ignore this. I got out my phone to call the police, but we were out in the mountains, and I couldn't get any reception. I looked for a landline, but they didn't have one. I had to go out there myself. I slowly opened the front door and peered out. I saw 3 men loading up tires and car parts onto the back of their truck. They were robbing the place. Hey! I shouted. What are you doing? The 3 men turned to look at me. If they got any closer, I'd slam the door shut and lock it. I didn't realize that a 4th man was right next to the door. He grabbed me by my hair and pulled me out of the trailer. He threw me to the ground and stood over me. He had a long pipe that he waved back and forth. What are you doing here? He shouted. I was too scared to speak. The other men gathered around me too. They were giggling. They started saying horrible things to me, things I won't repeat. The man with the pipe walked closer. He looked like he was ready to attack. And then I heard a loud bang. The man froze. He dropped the pipe. I saw red spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. Then he crumpled onto the ground, holding his arm and whimpering. An old man, at least 80, stood in the doorway, holding a shotgun. Get off my property, he growled. The 3 men grabbed their fallen friend and pulled him into the back of the truck. Within seconds, they drove off. I slowly got to my feet. I held up both my arms. The old man looked at me. He held his gun to the side. Who are you? He asked. I was terrified. This Confederate psycho was going to kill me. I never should have come here. I'm the babysitter, I whispered. The old man looked at me for a long moment. I gulped. I had no idea what he was going to do. Then he said, Well, then come inside. I think I might have woken Benji. He put his gun into the holster on his belt and held the door open. Slowly, I lowered my arms. I walked back in, and the old man closed and locked the door behind me.
"Sorry about all that,"
he said.
"but if you ever hear trouble on my property, come and get me, okay?"
Then he poured me some iced tea while I rocked Benji back to sleep. This whole experience was not at all what I expected. And even though I knew the neighborhood was dangerous, I felt absolutely comfortable inside their trailer. I've babysat for them 3 more times since. My name is Jesse, and I've been babysitting for the family next door since I was 14. They have a girl named Maggie, who's 6 now. She's really cute, and she's usually not too difficult. I only get $15 an hour, but every little bit helps as I save up for college next year. Last week, Maggie's mom called me up to ask if I could watch Maggie on Saturday. I was planning to hang out with a couple of friends at the movies, so I told her no. Pretty soon afterwards, I found out that my ex-boyfriend Ethan was going to the movies too, and I did not want to see that psycho again. So I canceled on my friends and agreed to babysit. That was a huge mistake. I got to the house at 7. Maggie's parents were running late as always, so they scurried around trying to get ready for some work party or something. They barely had time to talk to me before they hurried off. As they left, the mom told me that she left a note on the refrigerator with important information. I assumed it was the usual emergency contacts and stuff, so I didn't bother checking it out right away. At first, things were going great. Maggie was playing with her Legos. I sat on the couch and watched her. She told me about the castle she was building, and I pretended to listen. Then, out of nowhere, she stopped and whispered,
"There's a man outside. He's watching you."
I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. The trees were shaking a little. It could have been someone hiding in the shadows, or it could have just been the wind. We live in a pretty nice neighborhood, so I wasn't too worried.
"It's okay,"
I told Maggie.
"It's just the wind." "But that man was looking right at you,"
she said.
"He was scary."
My blood ran cold. Maybe she was right. I walked to the front door and made sure that it was locked and deadbolted. It was. Then I saw a movement in the yard. Someone was definitely out there, sneaking around.
"I think it's a psycho murderer,"
Maggie said blankly.
"It's not a psycho murderer,"
I told her. But just in case, I needed to find out. I unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. Their yard was filled with trees, so there were a lot of shadows outside, a lot of places for people to hide. I didn't see any movements though.
"Hey!"
I shouted.
"Who's out there?"
There was no answer, but I saw some movement from the bushes. And then I heard some laughing. That's when I knew that it was Ethan, my ex. It had to be. He was so desperate to get back together with me that he had followed me here. What was his plan? I turned toward Maggie and told her to wait right there. I said that my friend was outside and I was going to go out there and tell him to go away.
"Don't go,"
Maggie urged me.
"It's okay,"
I said.
"I'll be right back."
I walked through the dark yard. When I reached the bushes in the corner, I heard more laughter. It was very quiet, as if Ethan was covering his mouth while he laughed.
"Ethan,"
I said.
"What the hell are you trying to do? We are not getting back together."
The laughter stopped. Then, someone whispered, "I'm not Ethan." I gulped. That was definitely not Ethan's voice. I had to get back inside. I turned around, ready to run, but a hand shot out of the bushes and grabbed me by the ankle. I tripped and fell to the ground. Then, the man jumped out of the bushes. He was tall and thin, wearing a hospital gown. He looked furious.
"What are you doing in my house?"
He stood over me, inching closer. He reached forward, trying to grab me by the neck, but I twisted out of the way and stumbled back toward the front door. I ran inside and slammed the door behind me. As I twisted the lock, that man started pounding on the other side of the door.
"Let me in!"
he screamed.
"It's my house!"
I raced over toward Maggie and took her into the bathroom. It seemed like the safest place to hide. We locked ourselves in, and I called the police. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. The house was very quiet. Maggie kept asking me what was happening, but I didn't have any answers for her. I had no idea who this man was and why he thought he lived here. Maggie was sobbing, and all I could do was tell her that the police would get here soon. But after 10 minutes, the police still weren't there. I needed to go back out and see if the man was still waiting for us outside. I left Maggie in the bathroom and told her to lock the door after me. I walked around the empty house, looking for any signs of that man. I didn't see anything. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed the note that Maggie's mom had left for me on the fridge. I don't know why I decided to read it at that moment. I had other things to worry about, but I did anyway. It said,
"Dinner's in the freezer, just microwave it. And if you see anyone trespassing, call the police right away. My brother was just released from the hospital, and he's been sending threatening notes. Don't tell Maggie, I don't want her to get scared. He probably won't come here, but just in case, do not go outside." Just then, there was a loud knock on the door. The police had finally arrived. I told them everything that had happened. Then, I called Maggie's parents to tell them to come home early. They paid me double, but I told them I wouldn't babysit for them anymore.
I honestly don't even know how to start this story. I was kind of young at the time, around 7 or 8 years old, but old enough to know exactly what was going on. I lived in a pretty decent neighborhood, but my family was in the process of moving away. There was a large mixture of families with children and retired seniors living on my street. There was a neighborhood babysitter who always took care of my younger sister when she was too young to go to school. She also happened to babysit me as well on multiple occasions. She was always kind of rude to us. She was a pudgy lady with 2 annoying sons and a very weird husband. A lot of the local kids had gotten taken care of by her, so my parents always trusted her to take care of us. Everything was somewhat normal, except for the fact that she was always kind of rude to anyone that wasn't her own kid. Her kids were pretty misbehaved. They were always fighting, hitting each other with plastic swords, and always screaming at the top of their lungs. At one point, the younger toddlers had to take a nap, and she actually forced all of the children except for her own kids to sit in a corner and be quiet. Pretty odd behavior for a babysitter, but we never really thought too much about it. Another thing to mention is that she always took naps while babysitting. As in, she never paid any attention to the kids. She just shooed them away and fell asleep. She was also really notorious for giving her sons chocolate milk and telling all the others that they could just have water. My sister and I just tried to ignore it, but eventually we were pretty annoyed of it. My sister had a pretty loud mouth, so she told my mom how she treats the kids she babysits versus her own children. I'd also like to acknowledge that my sister had just turned 4 at the time, so she really wasn't that great with words. My mom was pretty angry that the babysitter did that, but she just let it slide, as we were going to be moving in about a month, and she didn't really know if we were being completely honest about it, as we were little kids, and you know, sometimes kids make this stuff up. The house that we ended up moving to is the same house that I spent a really large majority of my childhood and teenage years in. Things were pretty normal once we transitioned into the new house. That is, until we got the calls. We changed our phone numbers, so we weren't really sure how the babysitter and her husband found it so quickly. She would literally call every single day saying that we needed to pay her and that we owed her money. She was apparently just really angry that we had moved, and we were currently on the lookout for a new babysitter that was closer to home. My parents received these calls literally every day, and they always consisted of the babysitter or her husband always screaming, which meant that I could hear the voicemails and calls very clearly. They just kept harassing us, and my parents grew agitated and really worried. One night it all ended at around 10 p.m. when my sister and I woke up to the loud sound of banging on the front door. It had continued for a good 10 minutes, and it was very loud. My sister was just totally freaked out, so I decided to go see if my parents were awake. And they were. They were just opening their eyes and kind of confused as to what was going on. My dad had told my mom to stay upstairs as he foolishly went downstairs to get the door as I nervously stood at the railing. My sister had stayed in the bedroom because she was totally unaware as to what was actually happening. When he opened the door, I felt absolutely sick and totally terrified. There was my babysitter and her husband, who managed to not only find our address, but also our phone number. The husband started screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling,
"You owe us money. Pay us."
and shaking a knife while he said it. Yes, he actually had a knife in his hand. My dad told him that we weren't going to pay them and he wanted him to leave unless he wanted the cops to be called. Well, he didn't care. My dad went to close the door, but he stuck his foot in it, attempting to get inside our house. My babysitter was also yelling, but I couldn't really hear what she had said. We had a phone upstairs, so my mother quickly and quietly decided to call the cops, all while my dad struggled to get the door closed. Once he did, the banging and screaming just continued. They wouldn't leave our property. I was so freaked out, so I started crying. My sister saw me crying and she started to do the same. Long story short, about an hour after they left, the cops finally arrived, having just missed them. My parents knew their info based on the fact that they used to babysit us, so it wasn't too hard to track them, and they were indeed arrested. I had always wondered if the night that they did this, if their children was home alone or at a sleepover, especially at a time so late. Regardless, they were released from jail a few days later, but were not allowed to step foot near our house. I'm not sure if the woman still babysits or not, but if she does, I feel really terrible for the kids. We never really knew what their intentions were that night. My dad just saw the knife and just knew that they were up to no good. All I can really say is, to the psychotic babysitter and her crazy husband, I really pray and hope to never see either of you again.